In Matthew 5:38, Jesus tells us, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, resist not an evil person, but whosoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other." Now, that's not such a bad thing to be shed of, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. I mean, that's revenge, it's retaliation. We all know taking revenge is wrong. It's childish, it's puerile, it's juvenile to try to get revenge on someone. Makes you look like a small and petty person when you take revenge. Unless, of course, you're Ricardo Montalban in The Wrath of Khan or Gustavo Fring in Breaking Bad and you've got a flair for melodrama. Then you know that revenge is a dish best served cold. But still, that's a little over the top. I mean, even when in the darkest recesses of your heart you secretly want to take revenge, you know that it won't really pay off. And any revenge worth taking will probably land you in jail unless you do it very secretly. But where's the fun in that? Where's the pleasure in that? There's no satisfaction in getting revenge if the person you're getting revenge on doesn't know that he's been got and why. But then just imagine again how foolish you'd actually sound standing there before the person you've just gotten your revenge on saying, "You remember, 40 years ago you cut me off in traffic." And then you're back to being that smallish person who wants retribution. So for anyone who can see more than 5 minutes into the future, revenge isn't much of a temptation. It's pretty easy to avoid. Just be the bigger person, let bygones be bygones. But if we're really being honest with ourselves, I think that the reason, or at least one of the reasons, why most of us are satisfied to let bygones be bygones is not so much out of great-heartedness, not so much out of a benevolent spirit, but because we take God at his word in Romans 12:19. "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." Because even though we don't believe in karma, we do believe that under the superintendence of God, what goes around does come around. So we take the high road, comforted by the fact that in the end there will be justice. And this attitude isn't unbiblical. As the psalmist says in Psalm 58:10-11, speaking of God's justice at the end of time, "The righteous shall rejoice when they see the vengeance. They shall wash their feet in the blood of the wicked. And every last one of them will say, Verily there is a reward for the righteous. Verily there is a God who judges justly on the earth." Now that image is somewhat graphic, and you may be saying to yourself, "I would never rejoice the suffering of others." Well, the Bible says that you will rejoice upon seeing the justice of God in action. And that apparently includes the punishment of the wicked. And be honest with yourself. Isn't that why you watched Person of Interest? Or The Equalizer or Dexter? To see justice done? Isn't that why you watched The Twilight Zone, to see that twist of fate at the end? Isn't that why anti-heroes are so popular? Because they always bring swift justice. Well, let me just speak for myself, and if it makes you think less of me, then so be it. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I'm satisfied to leave injuries unrequited on this earth is because I am persuaded that God will take care of it. And that brings satisfaction to me. This is the flip side of the law of reciprocity. Luke 6:31, Jesus tells us, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you." But the Lord also teaches us that those who do evil unto his little ones will get what's coming to them. Some 35 years ago, a close friend of mine was killed by a drunk driver. The next day, someone cut an article out of the newspaper about the collision and gave it to me. And I thanked them for it, but I didn't even look at the article. As soon as they had left, I turned it over, folded it in half, cut it into little pieces, and threw it in the trash. Because I didn't want to know the name of the person who had killed my friend. I just didn't want to know, because I didn't trust myself not to hate that person. So I left the matter entirely in God's hands, and I've been satisfied ever since that justice has been, is being, will be done. So I've got no problem with setting eye for eye and tooth for tooth aside. But part of the reason that I don't demand eye for eye is because I don't see it as a loss. God will see that justice is done. You see, in Christianity, we don't believe in things like karma because we don't believe in things that are manifestly pagan and unbiblical. But we do believe in the patently biblical knowledge that by the providence of God, what goes around comes around. But that isn't superstition, that's sound doctrine. I'm sure you're all familiar with the saying, speak of the devil and he doth appear. Now, the way that we use that expression in modern parlance, it simply refers to the coincidental arrival of someone or something shortly after the same has been mentioned in conversation. But the saying itself is more storied because it's born of the superstition that to speak of a thing, good or evil, actually has causative power. That's why we say things like good luck and farewell and Happy New Year. Because biddances such as these are rooted in an underlying belief that the spoken word has thaumaturgic power or incantatory power. This is why people get nervous whenever someone says something like, "Isn't it wonderful that we've come all this way on our trip and haven't had any car trouble?" Because we have a fear or a suspicion or at least a notion that speaking of misfortune brings about misfortune. Now, all of you have heard sermons indicting this sort of thinking as being pagan in origin and fundamentally unchristian or even anti-Christian in nature. So we should watch what we say. And indeed, it's demonstrably certain that there are many brands of heathenry awash in this kind of magical thinking that have infiltrated our thinking without us being consciously aware of it. But it's worth noting that this same sense of cause and effect is thoroughly biblical. It's not in any way foreign to Christianity. The difference is that in the Bible, in Christianity, the economy of reciprocity, the economy that dictates that what goes around comes around, is superintended not by chance or fortune or karma, but by Yahweh Elohim, the Lord of creation. After all, we do not doubt the words of Jesus when he tells us in Matthew 7, 1 through 2, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For the standard by which you judge others is the standard by which you will be judged, and the standard by which you measure others is the standard by which you will be measured." Or again in Luke 6:38, "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured out into your lap. Or the measure with which you measure out will be used to measure back to you." Or Matthew 12:34 through 37, "For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of the good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." So we know, just as the superstitious do, that our actions have consequences, real consequences, both positive and negative. The difference is that we attribute the management of these consequences not to cosmic forces or to the universe or to walls with ears or little birds who tell secrets, but to our sovereign God. So whenever it occurs that we see somebody's actions visited back upon them, we would do well to attribute that kind of poetic justice not to fate, but to the providence of God. For instance, and this instance is longer than an instant. It's going to take a few minutes for us to work our way back around to where we started, so be patient. We'll get there soon enough. For instance, Paul was a student of Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was the grandson of the famous Rabbi Hillel, also known as Hillel the Elder, one of the greatest religious reformers in the history of Judaism. And Hillel is known for having been lenient, liberal, or what you might call progressive in his thinking. And he found all kinds of ways to soften the sharp edges of the law of Moses. And he had a rival, a competing elder, a competing rabbi, Shammai the elder, who was 50 years younger than he, and twice the conservative that Hillel was a liberal. And they differed greatly in their opinions about lots of things, and the disputes between them weren't merely academic. No, what they said, what their followers believed, had consequences. They were fighting for the heart and soul of Judaism, because whosoever ideas won the day between Hillel and Shammai, those ideas would eventually become public policy for the children of Israel, the law of the land, which law had teeth, real consequences in the lives of real people. Particularly when it came to Shammai, his bark was severe, but his bite was even worse, because Shammai held that it was the duty of every upright student of the law to enforce the law personally, and to take every measure at his disposal to keep Judaism pure, and to purge the land of those who would flout the law. You know, for decades, we here in the U.S. have been concerned about the occurrence of Islamic acts of terror being carried out on American soil or on American citizens traveling abroad. And that absolutely does happen, and it's a crime against humanity every time it happens. But the far more frequent occurrence of Islamist violence is not Muslim on Christian violence or Muslim on infidel violence. It's Muslim on Muslim violence. And the reason for that is because of a pervasive belief in various Shia and Wahhabi and Salafi sects of Islam that the biggest danger, the biggest threat to them and to their faith is not from without, but from within. As far as many of these true believers are concerned, before they need to worry about destroying the West or destroying even Israel, they first need to concern themselves with destroying Muslims who aren't Muslim enough. Muslims who aren't pure enough. Muslims who aren't zealous enough in their faith or strict enough with themselves or with others when it comes to keeping the 5 tenets of Islam. Well, where do you think an idea like that comes from? Well, it didn't come out of the thin air. Long before Muslims were killing other Muslims for not being Muslims enough, Christians were killing other Christians for not being Christian enough. And before that, Jews were killing other Jews for not being Jewish enough. And that's what Shammai was all about. And as I told you last week, according to N.T. Wright, in his teaching, Shammai lionized Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, for that very reason, because Phinehas demonstrated a zeal for the word and will of God that went over and above the zeal of his fellow elders. Numbers 25, 1 through 13. While Israel was encamped at Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to participate in sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. Thus Israel yoked herself to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against her. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and put their bodies on display in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Each of you must put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." Just then, an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman, right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into his tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's abdomen. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, when the toll of those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. And the Lord said to Moses, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned away my anger away from the Israelites, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites." You see, while all the elders of Israel were unhappy with their citizens, who were adulterating their faith by giving themselves over to the Baal of Peor, all they did was to stand before the tent of meeting and weep and moan about it. But Phinehas took action. His zeal didn't just have a heart, it had legs. And God blessed Phinehas for his zeal, stating that his zeal wasn't just commendable, but that it was redemptive for the children of Israel. And because of his zeal, God made a lasting covenant with him and his descendants, that the sons of Phinehas might have a lasting priesthood among the children of Israel. And accordingly, Shammai called his followers to follow in the footsteps of the sons of Phinehas, and let their zeal for the Lord dictate their efforts to cleanse Israel of its dross. Now Saul was a student of Gamaliel, but he was a hostile student, which is one of the things that Gamaliel apparently liked about him. Gamaliel was a liberal in the tradition of his grandfather Hillel, but his star pupil, Saul of Tarsus, was a Shammite conservative. And he sharpened his arguments against liberalism in his debates, in his Socratic dialogues with his rabbi, Gamaliel. And Saul was following the teachings of Shammai to a T when he set out to purify the nation of Israel by purging it of Christians. Because Christians, as he saw them, apart from being blasphemers who believed that their rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, was the Son of God, were also a bunch of progressives, a bunch of liberals, a bunch of leftists who were soft on the law. And as a proud son of Phinehas, Saul saw it as his calling before God to persecute them with great zeal. That's the zeal that Paul is talking about in Galatians 1:14, when he says, "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers." Whenever Paul speaks of his zeal for the Lord, his zeal for the law, being extremely zealous for the traditions of his fathers, he isn't talking about being a member of the zealot political party like Simon the Zealot. No, he's talking about the zeal of the sons of Phinehas, the zeal to purge the nation of Israel of subversives who utterly fail to keep the law properly and who encourage others to do the same. And in the teaching of Shammai, the poster boy for the zeal of the sons of Phinehas was Elijah. As far as Shammai was concerned, Elijah was the greatest example of a son of Phinehas that the history of the children of Israel had to offer, because he single-handedly put 450 apostate Jews to the sword. Remember, the 450 prophets of Baal that Elijah killed in 1 Kings 18 were all Hebrews. Those prophets weren't Canaanites. They weren't descendants of the son of Ham, that scapegrace who uncovered his father's nakedness and boasted about it to his brothers. No. The prophets of Baal, who did the bidding of Jezebel and led the children of Israel into apostasy, were Israelites. They were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, men of Israel who had given themselves over to Baal. They were Jews who, in Elijah's estimation, weren't nearly Jewish enough. And Elijah purged the nation of all of them, all 450 of them, by his own hand. 1 Kings 18, 36 through 40. When it was time to make the offering, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Yahweh, answer me, so these people will know that you, Yahweh, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of Yahweh fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God." Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Let none of them escape." They seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Kishon Valley, and he slaughtered them there. Which, by the way, would have been no small feat. I mean, even if they were restrained by their fellow Israelites, putting 450 men to the sword would be exhausting. I mean, just think how fatigued your hands get when you carve the turkey at Thanksgiving. Now exchange that Wusthof carving knife for a 2.5-pound Bronze-Age sword and multiply it by 450. Elijah must have been a beast to pull that off. But he did it. And he did it driven by his zeal for the Lord, purging Israel of Jews who weren't Jewish enough. Well, that's exactly what Saul of Tarsus is doing when we first encounter him in Acts 7. Only he was being more subtle about it, more furtive, less forthright about it, because he was acting as an agent of the Sanhedrin, a henchman of Gamaliel, who had assured the high council in Acts 5, when Peter and John were on trial before the Sanhedrin, that they need not get directly involved. Only what Gamaliel said was, "Yeah, you remember that guy, Theudas? He started talking a big game. Yeah, he wound up dead." And the Sanhedrin didn't have to lift a finger. Some people in the lynch mob took care of it. And then remember that other guy, Judas of the Galilean? He started making some noise, and he wound up dead. So no one here ever had to say a word. Somebody else took care of it. The high council wasn't even mentioned in the investigation. So what about these guys? Don't sweat it. If they keep talking smack, something will happen to them too. Something very unfortunate. Forget about it. God will take care of it. Then the next thing you know, a mob rises up against Stephen and executes him off the books in the public square with 1,000 witnesses, and no blood falls on the hands of the Sanhedrin. And who organized that mob? Gamaliel's protege, Saul of Tarsus. I mean, you don't think he just happened to wander by at the exact moment that this hit was going down, do you? He just kind of walked by with his hands in his pocket and said, hey guys, you want me to hold your coats for you? No. Don't be ridiculous. Saul was a made man in the criminal organization known as the Sanhedrin, a cartel that regularly got rid of inconvenient people through semi-official channels. Not yet a member of the High Council, but he would have been if he had stayed on track the way he was going. And by the time Acts 9 rolls around, he had upped his game and had gotten more directly involved in the purging of undesirables, doing so with complete legal cover, complete legal impunity, carrying official warrants issued by the Sanhedrin, hunting down people he saw as religious deviants and turning them over for prosecution, tracking down Christians, both men and women, for arrest, trial, and certain conviction. Kind of like Colonel Hans Landa, the infamous Jew hunter played by Christoph Waltz in Quentin Tarantino's history-revising World War II masterpiece, Ignominious Misbegotlings, or something like that. But after his encounter with Jesus of Nazareth on the road to Damascus, Paul believed. And he was baptized. And then the hunter became the hunted. Because as soon as Paul became a Christian and began preaching that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God, his former friends and colleagues among the Jewish elite turned against him. Because what goes around comes around. Acts 9, 19 through 25, Paul spent a certain number of days with the disciples in Damascus. Then all at once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. And everyone who heard him was astounded and said, "Isn't this the man who in Jerusalem was destroying those who called on this name, and then came here for the purpose of taking them as prisoners to the chief priests?" Meanwhile, Saul was being filled with more and more power and kept outmatching the Jews who lived in Damascus with his proofs that this one is the Christ. When this had gone on for long enough, the Jews conspired to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul. So they were watching the gates day and night, intending to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and lowered him in a large basket through an opening in the wall. Now, the way that that's presented in Acts 9 gives you the impression that this happened just a few days after Saul was converted. But if you were here the last 2 weeks, then you know that there was actually a 3-year gap in the middle of that. The first thing that Paul did after he was baptized was to leave Damascus and to go to Arabia, according to Galatians 1, 11 through 20. Kind of right in the middle of Acts 9:19, Paul left Damascus, went to Arabia, where he consulted personally with the Lord Jesus, and Jesus himself taught Paul the gospel by direct revelation. And this tryst with the Lord, it appears from contextual clues, took place on Mount Sinai, and it was there, it appears, at least to me, that Paul was caught up into the third heaven, where he was told things that he was forbidden from repeating. Now, if you want to hear more about that, I invite you to go online and listen to the last 2 weeks' lessons, number 313 and 314 in this series. The point of all that for this morning's lesson is simply to point out that the plot by his former friends to kill him, because after, just to point out the plot itself, because after his conversion, he wasn't pure enough. He wasn't holy enough. He wasn't Jewish enough. Now, that plot may not have been hatched immediately after he was baptized, but it was discovered by Paul within days of his return to Damascus. However, the actual plot to kill him may have been in motion before Paul even arrived back in Damascus, because according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, 32 through 33, in Damascus, the ethnarch under King Aretas had the city of the Damascus guarded in order to arrest me. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. And from this it appears to me that King Aretas developed an interest in killing Paul well before he returned to Damascus. Now, King Aretas was king of the area referred to in Galatians 1 and 4 as Arabia, where Paul went immediately after he was baptized. And with this in view, it seems to me that Paul might well have begun preaching in Arabia before returning to Damascus, and that his preaching there stirred up so much trouble that the king had already begun to pursue him before he made it back to Damascus, and that he was determined to see Paul pay for his crimes with his life. So Paul, who was more than willing to kill others to keep his faith pure when he was a Shammite Jew, was baptized in He was baptized in Acts 18, and in verse 18 of Acts 9, and before another 7 verses of Scripture had passed. There had already been 2 attempts on his life. One by Aretas, king of Arabia, and one by his former friends and colleagues in Damascus. Then he escapes Damascus and goes to Jerusalem, and there a 3rd attempt is made on his life. Acts 9, 26 through 30, when they came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stayed with them and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. He talked and debated with the Hellenistic Jews, but they tried to kill him. When the believers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. But wait, there's more. Because after Barnabas goes to retrieve Paul from Tarsus, and Paul goes back to preaching, then over the course of the remainder of the book of Acts, there are no fewer than 6 more attempts made on Paul's life. That makes 9 attempts to murder Paul that we know of. And all of his would-be killers wanted to end his life for the same reason he wanted to end the lives of all the Christians that he sent to their deaths, for religious purity. Now, there are any number of lessons I could teach based on that set of facts, but the single, straightforward, little point that I've been trying to make this morning is simply this. In the kingdom of God, by God's will and by God's ordinance, what goes around comes around. According to the Bible and according to the will and ways of God, what goes around comes around. James 3:18, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Proverbs 11:27, whoever seeks good finds favor, but evil comes to one who searches for it. Proverbs 26:27, whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. Psalm 7, 15 through 16, whoever digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit they have made. The trouble they cause recoils on themselves. Their violence comes down on their heads. Galatians 6, 7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Galatians 6, 9 through 10, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. 2 Corinthians 5, 7 through 10, for we live by faith, not by sight. Accordingly, we are confident, feeling every bit as much at ease in this body, our home away from home, as with the Lord. With this in view, we strive with love, whether at home or away, to be well-pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done in the body, whether good or bad. That's my lesson for today.